Cyndi, it has been a long time since you've been on the podcast. We're going to get into some discussions around growth as everybody is thinking about, hey, how do we grow? What's the risk of growth? How should we be thinking about growth and build toward an assessment that you created that we can point people to so they can figure out which stage of growth they're in. I'm not sure if we're going to cut this up into multiple episodes yet. We will cut the video up into smaller parts so that people can get to them a little bit more quickly, excuse me, and we'll be able to promote it through various social media. But anyhow, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
So here we are. What is growth?
Well, it means different things to different people. I would imagine. For a startup, oftentimes it's just proving your product or service. For more advanced or more sophisticated clients, it can be growing regionally. I have a client right now that's expanding into India and hopefully more into the United States. So it really depends on what their goals are.
Yeah. A lot of times I think when people typically hear of growth, it's growth in revenue. How can we grow? How can we grow the business revenue wise? Some might think about how can we grow profit? And others might think, how do we grow our customer base, even if that doesn't necessarily impact revenue or profit today, meaning we might lose some things. So to Cyndi's point, growth kind of changes depending on how you're looking at it from an organization perspective. I think for the purpose of today, one way that I would suggest that we look at it is growth in revenue, growth in impact, growth in profit, and figuring out ways to help our people grow in different roles, which ends up becoming a lot of different things. So what do you think?
I think that's a good idea. And it's funny because as you're saying that, I'm thinking of a client I just spoke with this morning, and they're not aligned on what growth meant.
Yeah.
So what should have taken 10 minutes ended up taking the full hour, but it was a great conversation because if they're not aligned, it could be problematic.
Well, and that's the thing. I think about any conversation you have inside your organization. If you're not aligned, if you're not clear on definitions, meaning and typically I'll pick up a dry erase marker and a pen and say, both of them write in black. One is intended to work on that thing behind me. The other one will not work on the thing behind me. And if I had a Sharpie in my hand, that could do some damage on the thing behind me. And the thing behind me is a whiteboard. When we talk about writing in black ink, if everybody around the room assumes that we're talking about the same kind of writing or the same kind of ink, we get ourselves into trouble because we start building in the wrong direction. So taking the time to pause and gain clarity around the definition of what it is that we're talking about is really important. So let's talk specifically about growth from a revenue perspective. Like what are some common challenges when it comes to organizations thinking about or starting to work on figuring out the growth challenge from a revenue perspective?
I think what I see with my clients is the biggest issue with growth. Well, there's two things that come to mind. One is the perception and trying to build into the culture that they have to always be hungry. So they have to always be looking at growth. And that could be problematic as well. We'll talk more about that, I'm sure. The other scenario that can tend to happen is the time frame of growth. Like we may be aligned in terms of growing revenues, but the buy when becomes a piece that creates a little bit more lack of clarity. I could be thinking into this year, somebody else could be thinking into 2027, and we're like, yeah, that's right, yeah, let's do this, and then it's like, wait a minute, when did you want to accomplish that by? So that tends to come up as well.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. We get into this view not only around what is it, but also and timing and what the expectations are. And then one of the ones that I've seen happen a lot is an executive goes to a conference or hears something on a podcast or is talking to a friend over the weekend at a barbecue or has a meeting with investors. And they're like, wow, you should be doing this. And all of a sudden, squirrel, and scope creep starts happening and everybody starts chasing in a direction because we think, okay, well, there's an opportunity for us to grow fast in that direction. And if you
Mhm.
keep growing fast in multiple directions, you'll find yourself running around in circles and running your team
Yeah.
ragged. So another challenge that typically happens and it gets into that action piece is sometimes shiny things get thrown in front of us and we
Yeah.
start chasing those opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of my clients don't tend to have a process for vetting out which squirrel is actually they really should run after and which ones they really should let go by the wayside. And I kind of think about it in terms, and you've heard this, Mike, before the horse race. And I talk about this quite a bit, where one horse is growth and your other horse is infrastructure, fulfillment, capacity, or the capacity to grow. And sometimes we think, oh, if I'm always hungry, I always have to have my growth horse ahead. But, I had a client who was just, really looking at growth, but hadn't delivered on time in 10 years. I mean, literally in 10 years. So then it's like, how do you slow down that train to solve a problem that will actually cause growth to be more managed and better in the future if they can also deliver on time? So knowing when to allocate their resources between, well, time, energy, and resources between growing and then building the capacity to grow.
Yeah, it's that piece that you were talking about a little bit earlier with infrastructure and I know that when we talk about it, we talk about it in the context of breathing, right? So there's
Yes.
this I can inhale and get a lot of oxygen and start creating this fire and really start generating and generating and generating and keep going. And then there's this other piece of in order to inhale again, I have to exhale and I have to get those systems and processes and structure in place. And there are a lot of people who don't like the idea of systems, process, and structure. And many of the times that I run into this with clients, it's because they think it's too rigid. They think it's going to prevent growth, it's going to get in the way of growth. And what
Mhm.
happens is if you can get them to pause just for a second, they start to realize, oh, we're growing too fast. We're actually going to burn everything out. And we're going to
Yeah.
create this area of organization risk or operational
Mhm.
risk inside our organization. So there's this balance that can happen. One of the other
Mhm.
things that can happen, depending on size of organization, is you can have a segment of the organization that is in a high growth mode, while
Mhm.
the other segment of the organization is in more of that stabilization and getting the infrastructure in place. And if you can time both of those inside the organization effectively, you can create some really interesting growth opportunities for your business.
Yeah.
You've got 6 stages of growth model
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
incorporated into the assessment that we're going to share with folks today as part of this. And if you go to findmycatalyst.com/growth, you'll get access to all of the resources that we're talking about today, including the video version of this. If you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, you'll get access to the assessment and you'll also see a link where you'll be able to book time with both Cyndi and I. So let's talk about those 6 stages. What's the first stage?
Yeah. The first stage is really the startup. I mean, they're focused on growth. They're focused on proving that their product or service is viable in the marketplace. Oftentimes when I'm called in, it's they're still testing with friends and family. And so it's really breaking through that space to get out into the get into the wild, if you will. And so everything is very chaotic and formal, and that's a fun place for some people to be. I like hanging out in that chaos for a little while, but then, oftentimes at some point, there's too much chaos and we could start losing people if we don't get some focus and direction, which is the next phase. And this is really where we've proven our product. We know that there's a place for it in the marketplace. We're probably still refining pricing and other things and features and stuff, but we know we've got something. And then at this point, we're recognizing that because we've been a bit scattered, we need to become a little more efficient with our operations. So we start reining things in a bit, and maybe we start creating some standard operating procedures. Maybe we put a little bit of discipline, if you will, and structure to the way we do things. And this is not a difficult thing for companies to move into because they're running themselves ragged at this point. I mean, there's a need, there's a crisis that causes them to go, whoa, we need to slow down for a minute.
So let's clarify. Let's clarify that first stage. So what is happening in that first stage? How are you thinking, feeling? What are you doing?
Yeah, I think oftentimes you've got a lot of risk takers in the room. So people who are willing to give it a go and see what happens. The culture is very informal. yoga pants, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just get the work done. you know, People are sometimes incentivized with a stock or a equity in the business or something that causes them to want to see this thing through because there's not a lot of revenue coming in at this time. The owner or small group of owners or founders of the business are often wearing a lot of hats. So while they really should be focused outward on continuing to grow and focus on the business, they are doing, they're in it to win it. So making that shift to how can I get out of the day-to-day operations and be a little bit more strategic tends to be a challenge for them in
So,
those first
so
phase.
in this stage, and this is that kind of 0 to 1 phase, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we're going from no revenue. We might be pre-revenue. We might have a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
revenue. We might actually be in a situation where we've generated some revenue, but at the same time, we've incorporated a bit of technical debt inside the business, both in the
Mm-hmm.
technologies that we've created and built out, or the people that we've hired inside, or the processes that we are have put in place. So this is that kind of less than zero phase.
Mm-hmm.
That can happen super early stage, and you've got to have a lot of generalists in the room who are really good at fixing a lot of things and can kind of
Yeah.
jump in and feel really comfortable with taking on some stuff. Then you start to shift into, at what point do we start to shift into this next phase? What's a trigger that typically happens that makes someone say, hey, I think I'm ready for this second stage of growth, which
Mm-hmm.
is what?
Well, it's really leadership. I mean, that's where the leader has to start pulling in the reins a bit and make sure that the team is aligned around where they want to go. What is the goal here? And so this is a really good time for a business owner or a small group, a senior leadership team to come to terms around what their short term and long term strategies are. I mean, short term, like within the next 12 months, short term, and then also be looking 2 to 4 years out so that they know that they're all moving in the same direction. Once they start getting a little bit bigger, now they're, beyond you and I talk about, can you all take one car to go to lunch together? Once they get beyond the minivan or all going in the same vehicle now, or they're located remotely, now we have to put some structures into place. So usually the leadership has to kind of step up and drive the direction that the company is going to an extent.
Yeah, one of the challenges you run into is you start to standardize some of these processes as people start to get things that they like doing taken away from them. Because you're
Yeah.
starting to hire people who are specialized in certain roles. And the cool part about it is people get to focus time, energy, and attention in the right place. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes what ends up happening is people are no longer the right fit inside the organization. So you
Right.
have to create some opportunity for them to exit gracefully into another business that's at the stage that they
Yeah.
are a better fit for. But this is that piece of we've done a really good job at generating some cash. We've created a
Mm-hmm.
runway for ourselves. Now let's start to standardize it so that we can get to a point where we start to build some scale.
Yeah.
What's the third phase?
So what tends to happen in my experience is that they get they start almost going too far. Like the pendulum is swinging to standardizing and putting some structure and discipline into place. And then it starts to get a little bit too much, too binding. And so at that point, we need to really start growing again. We've put some infrastructure into place. And now it's time to do the exhale again where they're going for it. And that could be regionally, it could be a new product, it could be a new market, it could be just scaling what they've done very well at. But there needs to be some autonomy that's given. So we start off really chaotic, then we get kind of disciplined to know what direction we're going, and then it kind of goes like, oh, this doesn't feel comfortable. Then we need some autonomy again, so people can start making decisions in those new roles that we hired. So the culture starts to shift because we're bringing in different types of people who are wired differently, and that can cause some shifts and change because we're starting to maybe lose that familial culture that we had created that people really enjoyed, and they don't want it to change, so then they have to become very intentional about the culture piece at that point.
And this is one of those areas where a lot of organizations will run into to challenges. There will
Mm-hmm.
be people who want to do things the way that they did it before.
Mm-hmm.
They want to be able to just go directly to Cindy to get something done because Cindy was the person who would get that thing done before. But what they don't realize is this: every time they're asking Cindy to take care of a challenge, they're taking her away from the things that she's focused on. Or if they ask me to take on a challenge, they're taking me away from the thing that I'm focused on. So this becomes, there starts to, a lot of tension can be created
Mhm.
inside an organization. At this
Yeah.
stage, what you're doing is you're hiring a lot of people. you're
Yeah.
you're starting to build out your executive team or your second
Mhm.
layer of leadership across those executive teams. And the big challenge here is people start pushing towards specific agendas that may or may not align with the organization mission and objectives and vision.
Yeah.
And now you create what could potentially turn into a lack of integrity inside your
Mhm.
business due to lack of alignment, which starts
Yeah.
to create some strain on the structure of the business, which turns us into this fourth stage of, hey, let's take a pause. Let's
Yeah.
start to stabilize. Let's build in some infrastructure. What's the infrastructure that we're starting to put place in this fourth stage?
So, and this is kind of where companies really go, like really start to grow and follow their passion, their growth track, or they can't quite get off the SOP trail and start becoming really bureaucratic.
Yeah.
And so this is such a critical part in the growth process in my mind, because I think this is probably the most common place where I'm called in to help, because there is, like you mentioned, it's very challenging to start delegating, especially if you're the founder and like you love the technical aspects of the work, but you're required to do more of the business development or the strategic partnerships. And if that person can't find how to best leverage their own skill set and those that they've brought in, it just it starts getting wonky. And what I mean by that is you've got people wearing multiple hats that are trying to shed some of those hats, and sometimes they don't want to shed the hat that they have to shed. And so, again, that tension comes in, and it becomes bureaucratic. So, and what I mean by bureaucratic, because this is sort of a political structure, is that policy and procedure really begin to trump our critical thinking about what we know is best for the business. It's a dangerous
It's
place to be.
a really dangerous place to be, especially
Yeah.
when people are making assumptions inside the business and they think they know what is happening, or they will in some cases operate under a view of, I'm doing what's best for the business, but they don't have complete exposure to all of the things that are going on inside the business. One
Yeah.
of the biggest challenges that I've seen, both with clients I've worked with and organizations I've been a part of as we go through this stage, is people start people are moved into leadership roles and they don't have leadership capabilities. They don't have leadership skills. They may not even have an interest in being a leader. They just
That's right.
happen to be the next person up who was thrust into this role and they thought, okay, well, this is what you get to do. And we don't, a challenge that we create as leaders inside our organizations when we do this is we don't give them the space to either learn, so
Mhm.
training and development and coaching, all of that kind of stuff. We don't give them the space to test, figure some things out, and apply
Right.
some coaching to kind of figure pieces out there. Or we don't give them the space to exit gracefully out of that role and move back into some kind of an individual contributor type role. And
Mhm.
all of those are options for people.
Yeah.
Remember, you're dealing with this wetware on the other side, this human being on the other side who has a lot of things that are going on inside their head. They may not be as well read as some other people inside the organization, or they may not have as much drive to go out and learn leadership skills. They may not feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, I need help. And you've put
Mhm.
them in a position where they're expected to perform. They want to perform, but they don't feel comfortable asking for help. So be really
Yeah.
careful about how you're putting people into leadership positions. You're
Mhm.
empowering and enabling them to be successful. But on the other side, you're creating the right culture for them to communicate effectively inside
Yeah.
the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, lately, or in more recent client experiences, I got certified in the core value index model. And that's been really helpful because, as you mentioned, people get moved into these leadership roles and their aversion or willingness to take risk, that can really impact their ability to lead from within. There's a number of different features that if you've got somebody in the wrong role, in a leadership role that doesn't belong there, it's going to be painful for them and it's going to be painful for the people who report to them. So, yeah, and just giving them resources isn't going to solve it necessarily. So, really understanding kind of their hard wiring and if they're really cut out for that role that you want them to be successful in is, I think, has become more imperative at the work lately.
Yeah,
So I
this is
see
where
that.
I really like. We've talked about a couple of different assessments, and again, we'll have if you go to findmycatalyst.com/growth, you'll see the video version of this. You'll see the links for the assessment and the ability to book time with Cyndi and I. COM-B is a behavior change model that I was introduced to when I was in a chief revenue officer role within one of my clients. And the first C, it stands for capability. That's a knowledge and skill thing. So all of those things can be trained. Then you get into knowledge, train, skill, training, and then coaching. Then the O is opportunity. Have we created the right operating environment? And as we're talking about these different stages that people are moving through, the operating environment continues to shift. And some people may be a little bit further behind in the stage or a little bit further ahead, but we've got to be conscious of the operating environment for which we're asking them to perform within. And then you get into motivation. And this is do they really care? Do they want to do it? Are they excited about the work that they're doing, or are they doing it just because they're filling a role at a given point in time? And if you can evaluate your team through the lens of COM-B, capability, opportunity, motivation, you can start to identify where there are opportunities to improve that will help drive behaviors that you're looking for inside the organization. And I know one of the things that you're very interested in, Cyndi, is the importance of incentives. So having the right incentive structure in place to help support some of the changes that we're looking for at each of these stages. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about incentives?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I think are important for managers to understand. And it's a really simple idea. We have rewards and we have incentives. And oftentimes managers will use those synonymously, and they're really different. We reward something that's been done in the past. Like, oh, that was really great. We're going to reward you for this with a bonus, let's say.
Sure.
Um, but then the manager oftentimes thinks, well, because I gave that reward, it's going to incentivize them to keep doing that work in the future. And it doesn't work that way. So to the worker, it's like, yeah, you rewarded me for that, not for what's ahead. So you can incentivize me for that, but you can reward me for what I did. And I think just being very clear with what expectations are for from each functional role is really important. What deliverables are we looking for? And really paint a picture so that the person knows, okay, if I am able to deliver on these 3 to 5 things that are in my role, then yes, there will be a reward for that. If you want to incentivize me to do this, then I need to understand what ring I'm going after. Like, what am I grabbing for? And this should be a little bit, aspirational. I mean, we should feel like I think I can do this. There should be something there to it. But a lot of managers, like I said, they think if they gave, a gift card for something in the past that's going to cause, and they're like, why are they not doing it anymore? They used to be so good. I gave them this big bonus. It's like,
Yeah.
well,
Well, and I think one of the other things to think about in this, because we're talking about these stages, and we haven't talked about time, like the amount of time that it takes to go through each of these stages. And a lot of that's going to vary depending on organization. It's going to depend on the people that you have inside your organization, the market that you serve, the type of organization you are, the culture inside your organization. There's so many different variables that will impact time. In this instance, though, when we're talking about incentives, one of the things to keep in mind is that people's view on incentives will shift over time. Like we're
Yes.
going through a period where we're going to be empty nesting here pretty quick. Our incentives are a little bit different today
Mhm.
versus where they were when the kids were 3 and 6 or 10 and 13. So there's your people inside your organization are going to shift and they're going to evolve. One of the neat things about staying in contact with everybody inside your organization and asking them really simple questions. What do you want to do? What do you enjoy doing? What work are you doing right now that you hate? What work sucks the life out of you? What work gives you energy? Of that work, which is high impact,
Mhm.
what is ultimately low impact, but still gives you energy? What are the things that are low impact that suck the life out of you that we maybe need to eliminate? And what are some of the things that are actually high impact for the business, but they suck the life out of you based on where you are in this season of your life? And we start to plot these things up against a 2x2, which will help with decision making inside our organizations. And these are the kind of things that Cyndi and I will work with our clients on doing when we're working both at an individual level, a team level, and team of teams level. So we've gone through 4 stages. What are the final 2 stages that we should be looking at or thinking about or that will come out when
Yeah.
people go through the assessment?
Yeah, so the next stage is really my favorite because the business has spent enough time and they've gone through enough sort of growth and infrastructure cycles that they understand it now. They have the direction, they have communication in place. They've avoided bureaucracy and now they're pushing decision making down to the lowest levels, if you will, or to the most functional levels. And I think that's really indicative of the next stage is more participative leadership. Really the senior leadership team is really grooming that next layer up so they can get out and focus on what's next for the business. And then that's opening up opportunities because with every void you kind of open up a new one. So that second layer, now you've got people under there who are like, this is something I'm interested in. You start seeing more lateral movement across the organization that makes sense because we've identified, man, Cyndi's really great at this and she loves it. She could be doing this for 10 hours a day. Please do not put her in marketing because she hates it and will poke her eye out. That's why I wear glasses. But we start to become really smart with the people that we have. We are intentional with our culture. People know what's expected of them. They're asked what's important to them, and then it becomes wildly participative, and that's when I see the growth really accelerate.
And the cool part about this stage, especially when you start talking about some of this cross team collaboration, the
Mhm.
integrating people into other teams, moving people into other job roles inside the organization, is it can really be a catalyst for innovation inside the business.
Mhm.
And so a
Yes.
lot of times people go outside of the company to bring new blood into the
Yeah.
organization. And the reality is you actually have some really interesting blood inside your organization that if you shift it into a new role, you'll start to change the way that you think about customer challenges, whether those are internal customers or external customers. The external customers, the ones who continue to pay money, the internal customers who help you fulfill expectations on the money and potentially grow things. So you can look at different ways where you take somebody from maybe a sales role and move them into a product role, or maybe an
Mhm.
ops role and move them into a marketing role, which will feel really uncomfortable for them for that period of time. But when they can look at the challenges that are happening inside the organization through a different lens, it's
Mhm.
amazing what can happen. And we see this happen over and over and over again. If you've created this culture of continuous learning,
Yeah.
beginner's mind approach, constantly iterating and testing and design. So we get into this period where now it's, and I think the way that you like to phrase this, and you've got a book up there with someone with a cape, frontline hero. You start to build these frontline heroes inside your organization. Is that the stage where this starts to become more clear?
Yes, that and other things. So you kind of stole my thunder a little bit because the last phase is really the one of innovation.
Okay.
So what happens in that last phase is, and yeah, be a frontline hero. It provides really clear language for people new to management, so they have a tool built and they don't default to parenting their team members. It's very important.
Does that happen?
All the time.
Why?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Why does it happen? Why do we start parenting our team members?
Because it's what we know. It's our default. It's like when we're pushed in a corner, we snap back to how we were parented. And I see this time and time again. I'll be working with someone and their default starts to pop out and it's like, well, let's talk about this a minute. Why did you choose this? What was, help me understand your response. And then it's like, okay, yes, okay, so your parent was a rollover, so you're like, I'm an avoider, they'll figure it out. Like, wait a second, no, that does not how it works. So really clear 4-step language first, say this, then ask this, and then tell them this. It's all about level setting expectations oftentimes in management and having something to manage too. So when you mentioned innovation, that really is the last phase of the growth cycle. And sometimes people think, oh, when I'm in the 6th stage of growth, I'm the biggest. It's not that. It's really how we think and address our business. So at that point, innovation can happen. I mean, it can happen at other phases too, but now we're really intentionally looking at like our product and service itself. How can we, iterate this in a different way that our customers, clients, whatnot, patients are going to really love because we've gotten all this other stuff out of the way. And the other really big thing that happens in this last phase is that, and this is a biggie, it's that instead of trying to optimize the parts of the organization, like we're going to optimize sales, we're going to optimize marketing, we're going to optimize operations in their own little silos, we realize that we really need to optimize the relationships between those parts. So, my favorite meeting is a monthly cross-functional collaborative meeting where you've got the lead from every area in the room, and we're all talking about our metrics, our challenges, who's upstream from us, who's downstream from us, how can you help me solve my problem? I'm stuck. And then business really accelerates into that innovation mode. So that's really how we get to that. It's not the last phase. There's still growth and infrastructure kind of continues, but we've gone through we don't hear we've always done it this way anymore at that evolution of the life cycle.
Yeah, and depending on how you're looking at your organization and how your organization operates, you might have different segments of the company at different stages. Let's say you open up, let's say you're a UK-based company, you've done really well delivering and deploying a solution in the UK and even into a broader Europe. So now we've covered Europe relatively well, and we want to apply that into North America. Or like Cyndi had mentioned, one of her clients looking at how do we expand from APAC into the Americas. Well, when it starts in that area, you come in with some of the information that you have from the organization, the way that it's operated for a period of time, but you're still in that first early stage of building out the organization and kind of figuring things out and learning as you go along. And your learning should happen faster because you've seen parts of this movie before, but now you know, and you know what you want to test and operate inside that area. So you're going to have different parts of your business that are going to be at different stages as you move through, and that's a high performing functional organization that can work that way. You then need someone who's going to manage and organize the orchestra as each of these pieces of music, each of these instruments start playing in different ways. And what I like about what Cyndi had said there about this innovation phase is there's an opportunity here to really focus on enablement inside the organization. How do you enable and empower your people at the front line to do the work that they are meant to do better and faster? It might be through some training. It might be through some coaching. It might be through some systems and process. It might be through integration of tools. And these are all deeply related to my love language. So that's the process that I go into, is this whole mode of, hey, how can we help to simplify the approach that we take in each of these areas so that we can achieve the goals that we want to achieve, either at an individual level, a team level, or team of team level. Let's shift into, actually, I just saw the nonverbal. Did you have something else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, just sometimes being across multiple stages at the same time can be detrimental though also.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and a case comes to mind of a startup I was working with. Well, they said they were a startup, and as you know, I'm digging in and getting to know the processes, and it was going to be a lean initiative.
Okay.
And I'm like, so how long? Because it was weird because lean doesn't usually come until later, but they're like, oh, we're a startup. So I'm like, well, how long have you been doing this? And it was like, oh, this is what's our sixth or seventh year now? I'm like, okay, you're not a startup. Like, come on. But what I learned in the process was they loved the energy and the startup feel. They
Yeah.
loved that like little bit of chaos and a
Yeah.
little bit of informality. And so through our work together, it's like, okay, how about we have a startup culture, but we're not a startup anymore. Like, you know, we need to be able, if we want to do lean, we're far along. We're good. And that was kind of a relief to them because they had the almost a not a paranoia, but like, oh, we don't want to lose our culture. We love it. It's so great. I'm like, okay, but you can't be a startup forever because you're advertising as a startup, but you've been around for many years and it just is confusing.
Well, and you can maintain that aspect of the culture while
Yes.
also in the background have somebody behind the curtain that's operating
Yes.
things, right? So there's
Yes.
there's different ways that you can do it. I think one of the challenges that a lot of organizations run into, at least what I've experienced, is they like to say that there's something, but they actually operate as something completely different. And
Yes.
then people have excuses. Like the leader inside the organization has an excuse of, well, we're moving fast and breaking things, and we're making quick decisions. We're testing a lot of things inside the organization, but you've hired maybe the more tenured leadership group that is in the process of trying to stabilize things. And what you're doing is you're creating an operating environment where they're unable to stabilize those things. They were brought in for a purpose to help create stability, and then you're trying to make them operate like a race car. And
Yeah.
that creates some really stressful tension inside the business where people start to burn out. They start to feel like they don't fit. They start to feel like they're not valued inside the organization. So let's talk about how people can figure out what stage they're what stage they're in.
Yeah. So I think, you know, doing the assessment is
Yeah.
probably a great first step because we address in the assessment all of the different criteria that we talked about in those six stages. And so it would tell them pretty quickly if they are kind of solidly in growth mode, if they're solidly, you know, building infrastructure and capacity to grow, if they're trying to do both and they're struggling to know how to spend their allocation of time, energy, and resources, that will show up from the assessment. And if they're kind of stuck, if they can't seem to sort of morph into that next level, it could be because they're a little discombobulated on where they needed to be. And so, you know, we can help them figure that piece out.
Yeah. And when you go and take the assessment, don't feel like you're the only person inside your organization that should take the assessment. Because if you
Yeah.
do, you're now looking at it through the lens of a very biased individual. You have
Yeah.
your own view of how
Yeah.
things work and what you want to change and all of those other things.
Mhm.
If you take the assessment and you share it with others inside the organization, we'll be able to aggregate the data together and start to
Mhm.
identify where some of the clusters are and different components, and be able to share that back with you as part of our process for helping organizations who are looking for help. And you know, typically, if you're looking for help, Cyndi, what are some of the things that you're feeling or sensing or thinking if you need help in this space?
Well, usually it comes down to being stuck. Like they just can't seem to get out of where they've been. That's a biggie. Or they're just not focused on the right work. So I mean they're feeling some pain from just not knowing where to spend their time and energy. They might be too focused in the business and so they can't seem to go on vacation or feel like work-life balance is too much. They don't know the thresholds of when to hire. They could be fearful of hiring, but they need to hire and they're not really sure when to pull the trigger on that. You know, usually it's those kinds of symptoms of problems. What makes it easy is that, kind of going back to the horse race analogy, when growth gets too far ahead, we can't deliver on our promises. And so symptoms of those problems show up. when we have a lot of infrastructure and capacity to grow and we just can't seem to get the business to come in steadily, then we've got a problem. So it's really, I think, it's the symptoms of problems when one horse gets too far ahead of the other.
Yeah. And what'll end up happening typically, at least what I see inside the organization, is we have a lot of meetings, but we don't get anything done.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about a lot of stuff, and it's like, hey, didn't we have a meeting to talk about that at some point in time? Well, who was supposed to do what? And you
Yeah.
realize, huh, everybody just talked about it in that meeting and nobody identified next steps and those next steps and moving things along. So you have a lot of meetings to talk about things, but it doesn't necessarily turn into change inside the organization. The other one that will happen is you'll agree on certain things and then everybody goes back and starts doing it their old way.
Yeah.
And that will happen inside organizations. And we laugh about it because every company thinks they're so special and so unique and so completely different. The reality is, up until the point that your organization is primarily made of something other than human beings, you will not be that different than everybody
Right.
else. You're going to be at different stages and you'll have different people inside the organization, and there'll be different tools that you can apply to optimize and create efficiency and break through challenges. But if you're in one of those companies where you seem to have a lot of meetings, but nothing gets done, you seem to have a lot of meetings and people go back to doing things the way that they were doing it, or you feel stuck, that is an indicator where there might be an opportunity to
Yeah.
start creating incremental progress and start getting things unstuck and moving forward. Is that
Yeah.
fair?
It is. There's one more too that really just stood out while you were where you were sharing, which is, in the first times, and we've seen this before when we meet with senior leadership teams and they don't really know their metrics very well.
Sure. Yeah.
They're not really sure how to use data. So they're collecting it, but it's not helping them make better decisions. It's not helping them change behaviors. And that's I think that's a biggie too. They just like when you start asking how's your business doing? It's like, good. Well, okay. Then you start asking a little few more questions. Like, well, I'll have to look for that. I'm not really sure. And we believe. I know you are on the same page with me, Mike, that we should be able to see if we go to a professional baseball game, NBA, hockey, whatnot, and there's no scoreboard, we're not staying. We don't want to just watch people run around all day. We want to see who's winning, but we don't do that in business. We oftentimes don't know what the score is, and I think that's a place that really gets things moving quickly.
Yeah, and the nightmare is in a lot of these businesses, at least what I see, is you have the scorecard, like someone's keeping score at an old baseball game, like where someone would manually keep track of strikes, balls, hits, who contributed to the out. As you can tell, I am not a baseball fan, but they'll have this entire stat sheet, but nobody knows what the score is because we're tracking all of the wrong stuff. We have
Yeah.
these dashboards like nobody else's business that has all of these numbers and all of this information that's there, but we're not gathering any insight. And
Yeah.
one of my favorite models to apply in this is the role reflective model. What, so what, now what? What is it? So what does it mean? Why does it matter? Now what? What are we going to do with the information?
Right.
And if you can't answer those questions around the data that you're tracking, why are you tracking it? It's not worth the time, energy, and
Right.
resource. So there's an opportunity here to really simplify and get to the point where you start looking at metrics that are true indicators of the score,
Yeah.
the scoreboard, the score.
Right.
So let's talk a bit about
Mhm.
a couple of topics that are really important to both of us.
Mhm.
One of those being leadership. So
Yeah.
why is there a current gap in leadership inside organizations? Actually, first, do you believe that there's a current gap in leadership inside
Yes.
organizations?
Well, first, we probably should talk about what leadership means because I think we both have
Okay.
different definitions of it. So you go first, and then I'll share what it means to me because we could be talking about the same word, but actually be going to two different contexts of it.
Leadership to me is how we are going to get to where we're going. It's like this, there's a leadership inside the organization. This is how we're going to get to where we're going. And
Okay.
the piece that's really important is the get to where we're going should all be aligned inside an organization. So that would be that helps to create a better opportunity for execution. But the place that we're going should all be aligned throughout the organization so that everybody inside the company knows what their role is relative to driving toward where we're going, like how they're contributing and how they're being a leader inside the organization, more specifically, a leader of self, so
Mhm.
that they earn the right to lead teams, so that they earn the right to lead teams of teams, so that they earn the right to lead organizations. So leadership to me is a view toward how we're going to get to where we're going.
Okay. And I think I might have heard also in there, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's of the mindset that leadership really helps create the thread from every individual's work to that destination point.
Yeah,
Like
because if
people
we're
don't just know that on their own, but the
they won't.
leadership should help facilitate how all of these pieces fit together.
If you're an effective leader, yes,
Yeah.
you should be able
Okay.
to help people see where that alignment exists. And one of the challenges you run into when you're an ineffective leader and you're chasing shiny things and you're constantly pointing the the light at the helm of the boat 90 degrees to the right and then 180 degrees to the left and then 90 degrees back over to the right, and now everything is pointed in all different directions. You have this issue where people don't know where they're going, they don't know how they
Mhm.
get there, they don't know how their work aligns, and you get into what I like to describe as this 4th of July experience where you have laser pointers pointing in different directions, the individuals, you have flashlights pointing in different directions, the teams, and then you have the boat kind of pointing in different direction, which to me is a lack of leadership. It's a lack of
Mhm.
focus. And where this typically comes up is when a leader constantly keeps adding more to the list of stuff that we need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and that speaks. I mean, it's a little different than my definition, which is good because they complement each other. I look at leadership because I look at it from leading from where you are, wherever you are within the organization.
Okay.
So
Yep.
I define it as it's a demonstration of the commitment to the success of people around you.
Okay.
So in that way, sometimes I did a lot of research on this back in my early days of teaching at Cal Poly, and because I was trying to develop a leadership development program, and I'm like, this is just not working. So this is back in the mid 90s, I guess. So that's how old I am. But it was what I found when I was surveying everyone was that people who held a position of leadership were pointing the finger to their team to lead. Like, you guys got this. We've enabled you to lead. And the people who didn't hold positions of leadership defined it as a verb, like they guide, they empower, they influence. And so you had these two distinct parties pointing the fingers at each other. And I'm like, well, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So as I thought about, well, what would unite both sides, obviously leading from where you're at, but how do you do that? And, it's really kind of a servant leadership perspective, I guess, is when we're always looking at how we can help and support the people around us to be successful, those businesses don't fail. So why is there a gap in leadership? There's a lot of reasons that there's a gap in leadership. I think there is sometimes there is a lack in confidence from, I'll call them the founder or business owner, just for a small business sake. They feel like they're the only one that can do everything. And so they, rather than grow the leadership around them so that they can go and do the more ownership level, senior leadership level type things, they just don't have the confidence. So then they start putting all these controls in and reading books and making other people read books, and you have to do this, you have to do that to become a better leader. And then it doesn't work, and people are like, I don't understand why I'm reading 18 books on leadership. Like, what do you want me to do?
Yeah. While you were talking, I pulled up I shared this on LinkedIn a couple of different times, and I should know this just right off the top of my head because it's a
Mhm.
simple definition of leadership that is much more clear and concise than what I shared earlier.
Mhm.
And but at the same time, your comments are making me say, okay, well, is there something that needs to be added to it? And what I've written down and shared before is leadership is how we move forward,
Hmm.
how we move forward. And and so it gets into some of the stuff that we were talking about before about it. Well, let's make sure that we're aligned so that we're moving
Hmm.
forward toward a given objective.
Right.
There are some who think of leadership as a title, a noun,
Right.
and there are
Mhm.
some who think of leadership as a verb, kind of a state of
Right.
being.
And that was the pointing at each
Yep.
other.
And I like how you highlighted that leadership is an act of service.
Mhm.
It's an act of serving serving yourself, it's serving others, it's serving your customers. One of the one of my favorite quotes around what leaders do comes from James Kerr, and it's in the book Legacy, and it's leaders create leaders.
Mhm.
Now, I kind of reframe that and say leaders build leaders. So I don't think you really create anything; you build up. So I think one of the challenges on this void or this gap in leadership is as you had highlighted, this disconnect on or maybe a lack of alignment around what leadership is inside
Yeah.
organizations
Yeah. What do we
and what it means to
expect?
lead. Yeah, really,
Mhm.
really good stuff.
Yeah, and I think, and so, and I'll take the service piece a step further because in more recent years, I've been doing this a long time now, and oftentimes there's like I love the messiest, the biggest, most complex challenges because even though they can frustrate me at times. There's always a problem to solve there.
Yep.
And what I've learned is it's not really about personalities or behaviors. It is about serving, but it is serving the entity itself. So when I'm meeting a senior leadership team for the first time, I'm really listening to their language around what what are they doing to serve the success of the entity,
Yeah.
because if everybody is focused on those metrics and the success of the entity itself, the health and wellness of the business, then all parties are served: the customers, the employees, the leadership team,
Yep.
the investors, and whatnot. The ripple effect can happen. But and so demonstrating the commitment to the success of each other isn't each other person, it's the function.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm in marketing, I'm demonstrating my commitment to the success of sales by making sure they have the tools and resources that they need to do what they need to do. So how do I do that? I got to know them. I
Right.
got to understand their challenges. And so when we're in that space where we're serving what's best for the entity itself, then I find that the void of leadership goes away. And oftentimes I think business owners feel like there's this huge expectation to be all things to all people, the leader, the noun, and then they lack that lack of confidence sneaks in, and then they start putting, like I said, all these controls and things in place, and then it's like an obvious void of leadership. So that's been something, in I'd say in the last 10 years or so, that's been really helpful in working with clients, is helping them identify what does it mean to serve the entity and how do we do that, and then watch what the magic that happens, because it's really all in the people, but the focus is on the entity. So it's a little bit juxtaposed in a sense, or counterintuitive is a better word.
It's tough too, right? Like because things are going to be will evolve throughout as the business evolves, as the team evolves, as the customer base evolves. Those things will evolve. The challenge, and one of the things I think a lot of organizations, at least that I've seen, struggle with is being really clear around things like guiding principles. Like
Mhm.
what are the principles that we apply in order for us to do the things that we want to do better and
Mhm.
faster inside organizations or on behalf of our
Yeah.
customers or whatever the thing is that we're looking to accomplish. And a lot of times people will throw up things like core values
Yeah.
and position those as guiding principles. And that
Right.
there's a difference and there's a disconnect in there. And this gets
Mhm.
into that piece around language and why that's so important. these are challenges, and they're people challenges, they're human challenges, and don't ever let what happens at a single point in time influence or impact your view of someone's leadership capability over a longer period of time, because you
Right.
never know what happened to them while they were driving into work that day.
Right.
There are a number of leaders, if you watch and observe their behavior over a period of time, they will certainly demonstrate their view on leadership, and that work of art will kind of come together. Can we talk about culture? Like, what's culture to you? How do you define it?
Um, Culture is every company has a culture, whether they've intended to create one or not. So it's sort of in essence, I think it's like what people do intentionally and what they can get away with and how fast information travels. And I mean, it's all of it. It's all of it's like an iceberg. When I used to teach a couple, I used to show the slide. It was like the things that you see above the water are parts of the culture that, how people dress and how people speak to each other. And if we have, casual Friday, like those are all things that are palpable and observable. But the undercurrent is our values and our beliefs. It's the way that we think, it's the language we use, it's our attitudes and understandings about things. And I call it the thinking wheel. And at any point in that cycle, from values and beliefs to understanding and attitudes, that's what those drive. Our attitudes and understanding drive our thinking and language. Our thinking and language drives our actions and behaviors, and those drive our results. And you don't have to start change, any at one spot. You can create change at any spot. But at the deepest level, it's really our beliefs and values that kind of percolate up to show us what is above the water on the iceberg analogy. And I think that, it's funny, oftentimes clients don't recognize their own culture because it is just those core values. And one of the things that I've helped companies do is come up with desired observable behaviors that reflect those core values. So, because I don't know what integrity means. I mean, I know what it means, but I don't, am I being that right now? I don't know. Like, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What's an example of somebody behaving with integrity that I can look at and go, yeah, I am being that, and I think a lot of companies miss this huge opportunity to develop their culture in a really beautiful and intentional way because they're just going with whatever's in front of them right now. It takes time. You have to sort of pause and reflect and get input from people and then coordinate what it is that we are all aligned around. And I love that work. It's really powerful work. It isn't just the fluffy, easy stuff. It's really valuable, important part of the business that oftentimes gets overlooked.
Yeah, and I'm cheating a little bit here because I pulled up my little flashcard where I put a simple definition on it so that I don't go into a long-winded thing like I did before. But it's how we do what we do. At its simple, that's its simplest frame. How we do what we do. How we,
And how we think about what we do.
there you go. Like, how do we go through and do the work that we're doing?
Mhm.
How do we engage with others? How considerate are we as we go through any of those processes or any of the thinking or any of the communication things that are happening inside the business? So how we do what we do. And it's hard for organizations to really hone in on that and say, here's how we do what we do. There's an organization that I work with who, from an order of operations perspective, it's safety first. Safety first. So how we do what we do. Number one, we make sure that everything that we're doing, safety is first. It's not just a placard on the side of a truck. It's we operate with a level of safety. We consider employee experience. Are our people happy doing what they're doing? Have we created the right experience? Have we created the right operating environment? We consider customer experience. Are customers happy? Are we able to deliver on what we said we were going to be able to do? And then the fourth one is excellence. So now those aren't really guiding principles. Those are values, a couple of words and phrases that can help people really quickly go through and say, am I operating am I doing something that's unsafe? Meaning, did I
Mhm.
skip a couple of steps because I really had to reach a little bit further to make sure that I'm able to connect the electrical fittings or whatever? You might get the job done faster, but now you've put the organization at risk. You've put yourself at risk because you might fall in that kind of environment. So we're not
Mhm.
operating in the way that we want to as a business, how we do what we do. And
Right.
I think there's a lot of talk about culture in the context of the type of people that we have inside the organization, the type of
Mhm.
things that we're able to do as an organization, kind of how we come together. And it doesn't
And
necessarily,
perks.
what's that?
And perks that people
On perks.
associate
Yeah,
perks with the culture.
free drinks in the kind of like the coffee room. It's been so long since
Yes.
I've been in an office environment. I don't even remember what the coffee room was, but like in the lunchroom, you get free drinks or donuts or
Mhm.
whatever. Or we've got ping pong or some of those other
Mhm.
things, and we've kind of gotten away. Some organizations are starting to get away from it. When I think of culture in this, how we do what we do, it's like how do we solve problems? How do we
Mhm.
make decisions? How do we execute?
Mhm.
How do we create alignment when it comes to goal setting and execution? How do we communicate? Like those are the simple things that help inform how we do what we do as a business. And all of these things start to get really tough because if you have a disconnect in leadership, misperception, misunderstanding, a different view, or you have a disconnect in culture, those things are absolutely going to impact your ability to grow as a business and your ability to execute as a business. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. On my website, I have the four pillars that I think affected it, which is the leadership and culture, which we've talked about, the political structure.
Yep.
Is it a dictatorship, a benevolent king or queen, an oligarchy, a democracy, a bureaucracy? What is it? What's the
Right.
structure? And then the reward structure.
Yeah.
And I think those four things, there's not really one that to me, sometimes I'm like, well, maybe leadership is the top of those four, but
Yeah.
really you could have the great leadership but a completely messed up reward structure and end up with bad results. So I really look at those pillars as being those that's my framework that helps me
Yeah.
kind of get to the heart of the matter quickly.
And it becomes a really good way to look at it. And I think we all have our
Yeah.
pillars. Like on my side,
Yeah.
it's leadership, culture, revenue, and execution. And
Mm-hmm.
typically, what I see is that revenue challenge inside your business is a culture problem in disguise, and culture starts with
Mm-hmm.
leadership, and leadership
Mm-hmm.
starts with self. And if we work through that piece, we will get solved for those three areas. We will get better at execution. We will get better
Yeah.
at achieving the results that we're looking for inside our businesses. And I think this is one of the exciting things about Cyndi and I partnering up on this is we're able to look at it both through the combination
Mm-hmm.
of operational effectiveness and
Mm-hmm.
creating those efficiencies, those opportunities to improve systems and process and
Yeah.
build out the infrastructure while also balancing so that you never get into that situation where one horse is too far in front of the other. Those
Right.
horses are kind of pulling each other along throughout the
Mm-hmm.
process and continuing to compete with
Yeah.
each other.
And we're driving the horses. They're not driving us.
And we should build on that because one of the other things that you talked about before on the culture piece is that culture can happen organically
Mhm.
or it can happen by design.
Right.
And the results of those things, just like building out systems and processes inside your
Mm-hmm.
organization, some processes will happen organically, some will happen by design, some systems will evolve organically, some will evolve with design. I tend to
Yeah.
lean more toward the design side than the organic side of things. What's the risk in allowing culture or systems or processes or go to market or revenue or the way that you execute to just happen organically?
Well, if they're working, there's nothing wrong with it.
Okay.
It's when they're not working that we have to take a look at it. So I think in organic culture, there are some companies that have really amazing cultures and they didn't do it by design. They weren't methodical about it. They didn't pause and say, let's talk about our culture today. But I wouldn't say they were lucky, but the results that they get and the satisfaction of the community members, all stakeholders, not just the employees, but the, outside the boundaries of the organization, it works. That it's not the norm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and what happens if you're too rigid in the way that you design?
Yeah, then it doesn't feel authentic. Like the culture, it should be driven by the people within the business. And so sometimes if a senior leadership team, I've oftentimes actually seen the senior leadership team has disconnected themselves from the culture. It's like the culture is for them. And that's a really weird, inauthentic way to look at how we want our business, how the entity is served, because that culture piece supports that as well. And so when I do culture work with companies, it's really involving every person who touches part of the process. Sometimes we'll even include contractors if they have an important role to play in the process itself. It's like, well, they don't work for us; they're a contractor. It's like, yeah, but how big is their influence on what we're doing? Well, that's kind of big. Okay, then let's include them. Or single solopreneurs, like, oh, I don't have a culture. It's just me. Like, really? Everything is just you? And then you find out they actually do have a team. They're just not employees, but that impacts the success of that person's idea. And so, getting people to think in terms of intentional culture, it doesn't have to be this big, long, drawn out, structural, week-long retreat. It can really be as simple as a few questions on how do we want this thing to show up? What's important to us? And then what I do is I'll codify the language that I get from the team and put it into themes and then, share it back with the team. And we go through this negotiation. Here's what you said. Does this speak to who you are? And it's funny when they say no, because I'm like, I used your language. But just coming to that place where it resonates with them and they feel excited about it. Like, yeah, this is the who we are and the what we do and how we get there.
And I think one of the benefits of working with an external resource like Cyndi and me, or Cyndi or me, or the combined
Anyone.
group as we go through, or anybody that's out there,
Yeah.
is they can ask questions that will help you shift perspective, and that shift in perspective will help overcome some blind spots. And too often, you can have a leader in the room who's very vocal, who overtakes the conversation. Sometimes you can have people inside the room who are really quiet and they just wait until the meeting wraps up to share feedback through back channels. Each of those approaches creates some risk. So having a facilitated discussion, a guided conversation can help pull out some of the potential blind spots and help reveal, some of the potential blind spots. And that happens over and over again. We have them. We have blind spots. Cyndi's wearing glasses. I should be wearing glasses. If I put my hand too far behind, I can't see it other than I can see it through the camera. But there is a point in time where that physical blind spot takes place, and just a slight nudge of the shoulder or a turn of the head can help you see the light and start to reveal certain things. Cyndi, what did we miss?
I think we covered a lot of ground, but I think we probably should meet again because there's definitely more things, and I've enjoyed the conversation. I think people could benefit from some of the stuff that we've learned along our paths.
All right, so we'll have part two. Love to hear some questions from everybody. You can contact both of us on LinkedIn. If you'd like to get access to the assessment and watch the video replay of this, go to findmycatalyst.com/growth. Sales is a thinking process. Business is a thinking process. Life is a thinking process. How are you thinking differently about yours?